Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and today I'm going to be checking in on my European night crawlers. My European night crawlers used to all be in one single container. It's a pretty good sized container. It's the VERMIBAG Mini. It can be seen over there in the corner. This system is coming up on 700 days old. At least the inhabitants of the system are. The inhabitants of the system were launched off 700 days ago. Over time, they worked their way up into larger and larger containers, eventually working their way into that bag. But when I think of these numbers here, to me, this is really the age of this population. This population has just been moved from container to container. I've never harvested the material that they inhabited. I never relocated the worms from the material that they were inhabiting. They've been in the same stuff that they're in now for almost 700 days. And, you know, maybe in a large container like that, it makes sense for it to run on and on and on almost continuously. That's the whole idea behind one of those, to run it continuously. Keep dumping out the finished castings on the bottom, keep piling in the new recyclable materials on the top, and then it remains as a continuous flowing through system. I've been using it as kind of just a big container. When I get around to harvesting this system 2 weeks from now, I'm really just going to pretty much empty it, and then I'm probably going to use like a light harvesting method to separate the worms from the castings. I've got a couple new containers into which those worms are going to be relocated in 2 weeks, and then those will become my two newest European nightcrawler systems. But at the present time, my current two youngest European nightcrawler systems are the ones that you see down on the bottom over there, the two ones on the right on the floor. One of them was launched only 13 days ago. And the most recently launched one was kind of a different launch than I'm accustomed to doing. In this case, all I did was I just kept the material and left all the cocoons that were in it, because I could tell that there were a lot of cocoons. And this system's actually being launched with just a bunch of old castings with the cocoons that were in them. And then we're going to see what happens. I've never done that before, so I'm curious to see how that turns out. But the bin that I'm here to tend to today is the one that was launched off almost 2 weeks ago, 13 days ago today. Over that time, 13 days ago, I had placed a few hundred worms in. Later on, I put more in. And then finally, 3 days ago, when I really called it quits on the old bin that was running my Euros, I did a third haul out of worms. I estimate that there's about 800 worms in that system that we're going to feed. So I've got a good amount of food here. I've got some old noodles. I've got some kitchen scraps, like, you know, cuttings of vegetables and fruits. And I've got a bunch of pulverized eggshell, so they're going to get grit today too. So we're going to get this thing up on the bench and we can get right to work. Now it's so weird, every time I pick up one of my newer bins it feels so light compared to some of my older bins, which are actually very heavy. I might have to get rid of this cardboard. I've been suspicious that cardboard might be one of the main reasons I find flying insects in some of my systems. And I sometimes suspect that it's because they like crawling up in between the layers of corrugated. And I just don't want to keep encouraging the ongoing, you know, moving in and expanding of the flying insects in my worm bins, or my wormery in general. So I might have to come up with some other sort of covering if I come up with anything at all. If I do, then we'll just have to see how that works. But if it just ends up being, you know, a continuous magnet for flying insects to come and hang out, then I guess we'll just have to see what we can come up with in its place. Got one worm right smack in the middle. It's kind of interesting because there's also right next to the worm a cocoon. So usually there's all kinds of castings. Oh no, mistaken. We've actually got two worms. So maybe it's the parents. Maybe the cocoon that we see right here was complements of these two worms. They're gradually making their way off the paper, but I think we'll help them out. Let's get them over onto the bedding over there. We'll just remove this paper so we can see what we're doing here. The only thing I've done in this bin over the past couple weeks since I originally launched it was occasionally pop in here to add more worms, and that was it, nothing else. So it was what I estimated to be 250, and then another 250, 500, and then another 300 on top of that, making it 800. very rough estimates, guesstimates at best, in terms of how many worms populate this bin. And after only a couple weeks, I wouldn't expect a whole lot of progress yet. 800 worms was only the count after the last inclusion of the final haul of worms being placed in here. So up until just a few days ago, it was only 500 worms, and up until a few days prior to that, it was only a couple hundred worms. So they're still just kind of in the early stages of making themselves at home here. All this black material on top, all this casting material, is just stuff that came over with the worms when they were originally released into here. I didn't go too much out of my way to try to separate the worms from the castings, so a fair amount of casting material that the worms were inhabiting came along with the worms when I relocated them. So you can see a lot of the materials I use here, just chopped up pieces of cardboard, torn up pieces of cardboard. See a lot of leafy material in here. Tubes, paper towel tubes. And here and there we're seeing a worm or two. The moisture's not bad. Everything has kind of a damp feel to it. On the video it probably looks a little bit dry because everything sort of flakes away from each other, and that's fine. It'll dampen up for sure over time. Every time we add food, especially the way I prep the food by freezing it. So all the food that I'm feeding is eventually going to just start thawing out. You can even see frost beginning to accumulate on this material. It's just sitting out here, and the moisture in the air is just collecting on the frozen materials. But as those materials begin to thaw out, they're going to start releasing some of their moisture. And you saw I had a plastic covering. I had a piece of trash bag covering the container so that the moisture within the system remains in it and doesn't evaporate away. So down here, seeing some more worms. They're pretty evenly spread out because when I fed this system, I treat the food that I build the bin with as their first feeding, so to speak. So even before the worms enter the bin, their first feeding is already in there waiting for them. Kind of already starting the breakdown process and starting the decomposition process even before the worms arrive. So in this case, the first feeding since the bin was launched, I actually count the bin as now having had its second feeding once this feeding goes in. Because that original food supply that went in with the bedding and everything else when I built the bin counts as a feeding, and a pretty generous one too at that. It's a pretty good amount of food that I usually include when I build a fresh new bin. So I just wanted to give myself a quick tour around the material throughout the bin, see how things are looking. I can't say I really found any remnants of food. Not that I was going out of my way looking, but I even pointed out how I was encountering cardboard and paper and this and that, but nothing that really appeared like food. Now that I'm kind of thinking about it, something like this might be food. It's hard to tell. It just doesn't seem like paper or cardboard or anything like that. But if that is the case, that they've eaten everything that was in here from the original build of the bin, that's pretty good, because they've done away with a pretty generous amount of food. Probably equivalent to what's in this tray here, maybe even more. So that's good to see that they've got a hearty appetite. Some of these things, something that's this far broken down, though, I assume that this is the sort of stuff that just came over with the worms when I hauled them over, when I wasn't really taking a lot of care to separate the worms from the material they were inhabiting. So it's a big variety of different things in here. And I think we're ready to make a little bit of space for today's feeding and get it placed in here. Not a lot to do. That's pretty much all we're after today. I was definitely curious to see how it's coming along. Well, like nearly everything else that I feed, the noodles were also placed into the freezer to make sure that they don't spoil. And it's kind of, they're in a block, basically. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to separate them yet. I took them out of the freezer maybe an hour ago. Not quite an hour ago, so it's not surprising that they're still pretty much frozen together. Although on the outer edges, I'm able to pick off some of it. It just seems like at the end we're going to have a pretty good sized chunk of this stuff left over. Oh, there we go. I was able to somehow put some shear force on there and get it to chip off. But I don't like putting in things that are either really big chunks or kind of clumped together, because then it seems like it's just going to sit there without getting any exposure to the inner portions of the material. So if possible, I want to maximize the surface area, especially with something like this, because, you know, whatever, this thing will thaw out, but the middle of it will just go untouched if it stays this way, but I might not be able to do much about it here. It's pretty much a little block of ice. It's fine. I just figured I would do what I can, but it doesn't have to be perfect. A little bit sloppy, but that's fine. So I used up some of these paper towels I had laying around. It's always good to add a little bit of extra bedding, although obviously in this case we don't need much because the bin is pretty much all bedding at this point still. But when I'm starting out with new systems, I try to be pretty generous with the bedding. Even though the system obviously doesn't need any, I'm just piling it in anyway. Trying my best to be a little bit more generous with the bedding in the worm bins nowadays, because it always seemed in the past like I'd been a little bit skimpy in the bedding. Even now you would probably have to admit that the bedding is a little bit skimpy. Maybe I've got another piece over here. There we go. Another paper towel. Gives me a good excuse to wipe off my hand too while I'm at it. I always try to keep, you know, at least one clean hand. Well, that's about the best I could do, right? Try to keep a clean hand so I can operate the camera, turn it on and off and stuff like that. So at least now my hand is nice and clean. I can manipulate the camera again without making a mess. Last but not least, we're adding a little bit of pulverized eggshell. It's my grit of choice in my wormery. It's just what I've got on hand in pretty plentiful quantities. So we'll just take the last of this supplemental bedding and spread it across the top. How does that look? Not bad. I guess the only thing I like to do typically is just try to make sure I'm not leaving food scraps out on the surface, because then who knows, maybe that's the reason the flying insects are coming in, not because they, you know, have a nice comfortable nesting spot within the cardboard covering the container. Maybe they're actually coming in here to feast on the food supply. So I'll usually try to get the stuff covered up at least to a certain point. I know that I've got plastic covering the middle section, but out here on the edges it's nice to know that it's a little bit more thoroughly covered with just some of the material in the bin, to not make it into like a little insect magnet space. So, alright, not bad. First, I don't know, do I call it the first? To me it always seems like the first feeding, because the build of the bin seems like its own sort of separate thing. So this is its first feeding since the worms were introduced into the system. How does that sound? So we're gonna let this system get back to work. I like the way it's looking at this really young age of less than 2 weeks old. I usually like to wait a little longer for my first feeding of any system. Or I don't know. Don't know what else to call it, so I'm just referring to it as the first feeding. But that's because I want the worms to really start getting acclimated and start breaking down the food that was already placed into the system. Try to use that as a gauge to see what they're capable of, you know. Because after a while, the addition of food on multiple occasions all starts to blend together, and it's really hard to tell how much of the stuff is left over from the last feeding or from the feeding prior to that, and so on and so forth. This is like the only chance where you can really see, you know, all that food that was applied in the very beginning, what happened to it, you know? Is it all gone? Are there still traces of it? To me, it seems like they were able to do a pretty good job on polishing off all that stuff in about 2 weeks' time. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty nice looking bin here. All right, everyone. I think we're going to put this back without that cardboard covering. We'll see if we are able to get rid of the bugs that way. I've been doing that in some of my systems, and I'm going to give that a try here as well. So before I put this back up on the shelf and sign off, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too if you haven't done so already. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.